I don't think Eddie could have chosen a bigger set of headphones to wear.
They look as if you're wearing a crown.
They're hiding my receding hairline, which is a good thing, maybe. Looks like some sort of band.
It's definitely a statement.
Well, apparently Eddie says it's part of the brand. You know,
It probably is now.
Is it? Yeah, that's the show. I'm stuck with it forever.
I thought you liked them. I must admit. I'm like, why does Phil keep wearing those? So you must really.
No, Eddie just thrusts them on my head. I don't choose to put them there.
Okay.
He kind of positions them like this. I just do what he says, you know.
It's the only person you do that to, isn't it? No, you don't do it for anybody else.
Well, I don't know about that.
Don't know what Eddie's magic is, but we need to find out.
All right. So shall I do the intro and then we can get stuck into it?
Yeah.
So at this time of the year, many companies are involved in planning and budgeting for 2023, perhaps with a deep breath. Almost 2/3 of chief economists believe a global recession is likely in 2023, of which 18% consider it extremely likely. According to Goldman Sachs, they forecast a contraction of 1.2% of real GDP for UK's economy. However, it's not all gloomy. The good news is, even with the backdrop of redundancies, and we're seeing it from organizations like Microsoft, Google, and Salesforce, etc., Amazon, the unemployment rate on the whole remains at historically low levels of just 3.7%. That's the lowest in 50 years. And businesses are crying out to recruit staff. So that being said, we thought a good theme of this podcast is what sales leaders need to consider going into 2023. And in this podcast, we will explore themes around awareness, development and purpose. But I'm sure as we discuss these things, we'll meander into different areas too. And I am joined today by our very own Louise Sutton, the Academy Director at Consalia, and Will Squire, the CEO. So, guys, over to you. Broadly speaking, what are the biggest shifts that sales leaders need to consider this year?
So, I will always focus on the people side of things that sales leaders need to consider. And, the complexity continues, the fast pace continues, the, demands from customers and their expectations continue to grow. And so for me, it's how are they going to support their team with all of these dynamics going on? How are they going to help their team feel empowered and motivated and able to give them, put in the extra mile to make sure that they can achieve for themselves, but also for their organizations. And I think for me, that's a big, how are they going to do it? There's so much to consider, but that kind of engagement and motivation and support through these kind of, very, very sort of rapidly changing, complex times just is what it's about.
Yes, well, of course, I sort of largely support what Louise is saying, and I think the role of a sales leader is quite complex because on the one hand, they need to be able to use their resources in order to achieve the results of today, and at the same time, they need to develop their resources in order to achieve the results of the future. And there's a huge tension actually between those two kind of objectives. And within the context of the market in which organizations are having to operate in, like Louise was just saying, there's so much complexity and so much change. And when you talk about the biggest shifts, I think I'm not sure if they're the biggest shifts or it's just a continuation of things we've had to have been adjusted to since the pandemic and all the rather seismic changes going on in the marketplace. but they really need to be in tune with the organizational context of the world in which they are living in, and trying to anticipate the changes perhaps before they happen, if they can, protect their sales teams, from the noise that flies around the boardrooms, in these current uncertain times, and keep their sales teams motivated and keen to develop moving forward. I don't know if that's so much a shift, but I do believe that the context, with the current economic uncertainty, the Ukraine war, and all those other things, is making their job so hard at the moment. I think it's pretty tough.
I don't think necessarily that is a shift, Phil. I think it is a continuation of last year. You're right, but I guess there's more that's come in. So the whole dynamics around hybrid working and other people who now want to be in the office, and how do you manage the very different needs of different members of your team to make a cohesive team is, kind of that one evolved through last year, didn't it? And it's certainly one that's around now. And I think, ensuring that you can still keep collaboration and that team culture going when you've got everyone working in so many different locations in so many different ways. So I think that for me, that's just an example of extra complexity, like you were saying. But I do think it's just this general theme now about adaptation and coping with change and helping everyone through all of the shifts, the continual shifts that are going on.
And I think as well, I mean, I read in McKinsey that the customer expectation is also changing. So there's these kind of internal shifts that sales leaders need to be aware of, and how to sort of manage their teams with the backdrop of uncertainty and change. But it's also the expectations of customers, and their shifts are also changing and are adding more pressures on salespeople, and the implication of that. And McKinsey says that implicates how the channels through which sales needs to engage with their customers, the technology, how to engage with their talent, the incentives and culture. All of these are really contribute to what sales leaders need to be really aware of in 2023.
Yeah, I wonder whether there's, we're talking about sort of technologies and buying habits, whether there's going to be a shift away from a kind of CRM management-centric systems to, using technologies that are much more designed around the capability, around the salesperson, i.e. making their lives more easy in order to help sell. You rightly say that, the millennial influence in purchasing decisions, we're seeing trends there, which are quite interesting. But how can we become smarter at the way that we can use our technology resources in order to get the messaging to the right customers at the right time? How can we better account manage with limited resources, and so on and so forth? So I think that's going to be potentially one of the biggest shifts we're going to see, and literally the tools and the technologies also that can enable a sales organization to perform well. And for sales leaders, they really do need to be on top of that.
Quite an interesting one, Phil. I think, there seems to be a move away from CRMs and into new sort of cloud sales systems and customer focused systems. But I was reading something, I think it was in the Harvard Business Review, about being mindful of the complexity of IT, introducing too much too fast, or and just that it might stand in the way of success. So that's got to be managed really carefully. And in that article, they talked about, I just made a note of it because it was so, I'm always after simplicity, as things simple. And it said 46% in a survey responded saying that reducing complexity drives innovation. And one of the things that's really important, for organizations now is to stay ahead. And innovation is clearly a key part of that. How can they keep one step ahead of their competitors? So, and it made me think, I was like, wow, yeah. So, that reducing the system's complexity or just reducing complexity can improve innovation. And do we sometimes get caught up in doing something one way because that's the way the system's guiding you? So you forget to sit back, you forget to have that space and opportunity because you're being steered through the systems. It's just something that crossed my mind when I was reading it. But I do think, innovation is so important. And that's, again, something that the sales leaders need to be thinking about. How can they help their teams innovate? And you're right, maybe it is through improved systems. But there's always that balance, isn't there? At some point to make sure you've got enough of the systems to help innovation, but not too much to cramp it.
I mean, I've got a question then for you, Louise, around what can sales leaders do to create that sort of environment for innovation for their teams?
So, innovation needs some downtime, some thinking time, some space. It's this is what I believe, that yes, there's times for people to think independently, to let ideas mull and create, and then bring them together in the team to have that collaboration and sharing. But that's when the whole psychological safety comes in. Let everybody have a say. Let's listen to all the little nuggets that each person has. Again, that combination of giving people some time to think, some training, some ways to generate new ideas, and then bring them all together to really consider how can they do things better. Appreciative inquiry is a good one. Remembering what you do well. How can you build on that? But people need time to think like that. And because of the fast pace that we're all working at, we don't often give ourselves that time.
Your point about sort of coming into the office and that sort of social interaction as well is talking about innovation. I think you can do so much more with personal innovation than you can do, through physical being in the same room than remotely potentially. There's something special about bringing people together in a structured way. Perhaps giving them the time to reflect and brainstorm and innovate, which you don't get with people who are remote working all the time. So I'm really pleased now that we're seeing this trend to come together more often. There's a balance, obviously, with this hybrid world in which we live. But there was an interesting LinkedIn article about the randomness. I don't know if you've seen it, posted by someone who's quite close to us, Claudia. And it's this notion of innovation and random thoughts. And it just sparked this whole idea around innovation, and how important that is in a world that's changing so quickly.
Yeah.
And I love the fact you talk about space. And I know we're coming at space from slightly two different angles here, because do you remember the space curve that we developed as a consequence of the pandemic? I think that's so true now. Space was, survival, then preservation, and then agility and co-creation. So I agree. Yeah, in a world that's so fast moving, being able to find that time to reflect is so important. I think it's really difficult because there's no doubt that this year we're going to see targets increasing and resources decreasing, and it's just going to be putting a huge amount of pressure, I think, on sales teams to hit their targets and quota. I think we've seen a survey recently that talked about quotas being increased, and I think that's so true. Never seen a year where targets have decreased, even with all of these external factors going on. So to be able to do it, I think is going to take a lot of mental resilience, I think, to make sure that we can give the teams the space to be able to innovate and come together and reflect.
Well, I think, it's one of those, if you don't do it, what's going to happen? And if you don't do it, then what's to say that they are still going to, increase their quotas or, meet those increased quotas? Because if they haven't got that ability to rest and recover and innovate, and they're just doing things the same way, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to meet those quotas. So you have to think about what are the implications of not giving them space.
Is creating space for an individual or a team as simple as blocking out time in the diary, or how would you as a leader advise sales leaders to create that space for the teams?
It's a really difficult one. So everyone's so individual, but I think it's knowing what the person. So there is something there about getting to know individuals more personally, and how might they create that space, asking them that question. So for those that like the walking, sessions, for those that like to just sit down and read and ponder, but it's I guess trying to talk to them about how can they do that, what makes them innovate. For me, if I'm on a walk, I've got ideas spinning around all over. I think much better outside than I do inside. So, or when I'm driving, actually, sometimes then you can never write it down, can you? But anyway, so I guess it's individual, but you've just got to have those conversations. I think there is something now as well about knowing your team, really knowing them, understanding what makes them tick and helping them with that, rather than treating everybody the same.
I think it's culture, isn't it? We talk about culture and strategy, and it's what kind of culture do you want to create in your team? And if you've got a culture that you can encourage of reflection and practice, and recognizing the importance of giving people time, then you will make space for yourself to do it, but also other people around you to do it. So yeah, I think a lot of this is about the way in which sales leaders need to create the right culture to enable their sales teams to thrive.
But from my experience as well, because I know very well that we will get caught in the trap when we need to deliver results, is often, especially as we kind of get towards the end of a quarter per se, that's the time really you need to have that space when the pressure is really increasing, to think creatively and innovatively. One thing that I think is incredibly effective, certainly with my team, is creating space for coaching conversations as well, because it's through coaching where you're encouraging that sort of reflective practice, that can enable the individual to come up with ways of taking control of something, or innovative ideas that they may not have otherwise thought of. But having those coaching conversations really helps, certainly if they're not managing to find time in their weeks to kind of take themselves out of that situation for reflective thought.
That's excellent. Well, I mean, coaching is a big thing, isn't it? And I think for sales leaders to bring coaching moments as well as coaching, making time for full coaching conversations is really important. So to bring coaching into the skill set of a sales leader is so important.
And ultimately, I just think it creates trust. It creates trust in the team as well, and of course, you want to create. If we're operating in a world of uncertainty and huge amounts of change, you need that trust. You need the trust of sales leaders, because that enables you almost to take risk and to to try new things and be out of your comfort zone. And I think that's where innovation really stems from. Yeah,
to be encouraged and supported to try new things, and if it doesn't work, being there to support, to then still encourage them to try again with something else is so key. I think there's something that you touched on earlier too, which is around the generational shifts and then the different expectations of the new generations that are coming through, and or taking more of a prominent position in the workforce. And you're saying that millennials are the prominent decision makers now. What does that mean in terms of change for sales leaders, and how they train their teams and support their teams and work with their customers? And I think that's a really interesting one, because we've always kind of thought, well, people will move into the roles and act the same way, but everyone's coming in with a new expectation of how they should operate. And I think one of the things that I've been really thinking about and, researching a bit more on is around this whole notion of sales being a profession and the professionalization of sales. And I think for me, really, it's about making sure that there's more professional practice within the teams, that if we can upskill everyone to sell in a professional way, and that professional practice is what they're striving for, that's what's important for our customers, and it's what's important for our organizations. And that there are emerging professions, and you have the old traditional hierarchy of professions, and sales is obviously one of those that's going to coming through as a contemporary profession or an emerging one. Is that important? What's important is how people are selling, and that they're selling professionally, really. And I think that's something that I would just want sales leaders to be more conscious of, selling and helping their teams to sell professionally, rather than this notion of sales being a profession.
That's really interesting. And I know we're familiar with the term professional practice, Louise, but for those that might not know what you mean by professional practice, could you just go a bit deeper and describe what we mean by it?
So I think with professional practice, to me, it's about a habit of the way you're working, and the development of knowledge and skills that enable you to do things very well, professionally, meeting the needs of the customers, meeting the needs of the organization. And you're starting to develop your, people sometimes call it inner wisdom. You're becoming this person that is the rounded sales professional. You're doing things the way they should be done. I mean, we know that in that old hierarchy of professions, people didn't always operate professionally. You had rogue solicitors, rogue lawyers, rogue accountants. You have rogue people. It's actually what you do that makes you that professional person. So professional practice is continually learning. We've talked about the practice of reflection and bringing in coaching. So, through those kind of experiences and interventions, you are going to help your sales team pick out the best of what they're doing and continue with that, but learn why it's the best. And therefore you're developing this professional practitioner, the person that knows what they should be doing. And, sometimes, I think last week, Phil, we talked about intuition. Eventually they're going to develop that kind of intuition, that they know what to do when for different customers, because they've built up this kind of bank of experience. And that's what we're trying to, I think, start getting people to do. So there's a lot of upskilling, keeping them current with the trends. But that's what I mean. Does that make sense? Does that work for you too?
Well, it certainly works with me. And it really does make sense when you consider the amount of change and ambiguity, I think, as well as we're kind of operating in. Phil, what do you think
about professionalism? No, I certainly, we're on the same page as far as that's concerned, and 100% agree. In terms of it being a biggest shift, is this notion of professionalism one of the biggest shifts as we need to consider into this year? I'm not sure. I think it's it's huge. It's like a foundation building block I think you need for every year. And so if we're focusing on the biggest changes coming into this year, for me, it's a kind of coming back to the way in which we look at information and data. And, for example, if we're coaching, it's making sure that we're coaching to the right things. It's making sure that we're coaching to the right objectives. And we had an interesting call just this morning about, the difference between looking at forecast and pipeline, and the problem that we've got in an environment where pressure is so big on results on a quarterly basis. You get people focused on forecast rather than pipeline, and so they don't get those longer term conversations, just aren't there, because there's this relentless pressure on meeting quarterly objectives. The concept of customer lifetime cycle, which I know is a topic close to your heart, Will, suggests that organizations need to think much longer term now about the way they build customer relationships. I know for us at Consalia, this is becoming a key issue of, we take these young apprentices who are 18, 20 years old, but they're going to have a career in sales, and it's getting into a mindset of putting them at the center, not just of their education, but actually of their career over the longer term. So I think this is an issue which I'm hearing from some of our customers is becoming big. They're moving from landing customers or just focusing on net new names, and they're now beginning to look at customer value over a lifetime. And so, but coming back to this issue of forecast versus pipeline, you've got this relentless pressure on this quarterly target that's stopping a lot of the reflection that Louise, you've been talking about, because they don't have the time, to do it. We know that they need to have the time. So it's the enlightened sales leader, that perhaps it is the sales professional leader that we've been talking about that is recognizing what's going on in this crazy, fast-moving world and manages somehow to get this balance between short-term versus long-term, with the emotional intelligence that you need to actually cope with some really tough selling environments that sales organizations are in.
Mm.
So I know I've sort of given quite a lot of information there, but I think I keep on saying each year, I think the role of a sales leader is getting tougher. I really do think it's quite tough now.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, Harvard Business Review surveyed nearly 500 sales execs, and 60% recognize that future planning is an area of improvement that they needed to implement in their organization. I think what you've just said is echoed by a lot of leaders out there. There's sort of short-termism, and in fact, actually, what is that longer-term picture, and how can you prepare or anticipate for that?
I think what's interesting about that survey is that it was from salespeople and it wasn't from sales leaders.
Mm.
And this is where I think some of the problem is. Another topic that's really interesting is this purpose-led organization and the focus on sort of environmental issues and so on. Many companies pay lip service to it, and I think but I think there is a change. We were running a workshop the other day with a big tech company, and we were looking at this whole area of sustainability, and they invited one of their customers to actually come into the workshop and talk about the importance of those those goals. And there's absolutely no doubt that they are going to be selecting suppliers who are aligned to this purpose-driven agenda. So I think an emerging shift is going to be a more purpose-led environment. And I suppose you could take that word purpose-led and you could say it's to do with values, it's to do with professionalism, it's to do with sustainability. You know, could be an overarching umbrella for many of the things that we've been talking about. Interesting to see, again, in Harvard, they're talking more about mindsets. You know, we spoke about this the other day, Will. So I think there is a shift. But I still think there's a tension, which is going to make the shift difficult between short-term versus long-term, and being able to let go of old habits and we talk about let come new habits, to drive performance.
I'm just thinking of some of our apprentices and students, and obviously observe them through that monthly and quarterly cycle and their end of year month, when you just don't expect anything from them at all because of the pressures that you've described. And but I think in that they do have that kind of first breather of the first week of the month or the second, where they can start to just try and regroup before again the pressure starts to ramp up. So I guess it's, in terms of you thinking, how do they manage the tactical with the long term? I think it's somehow giving them that permission to try and think more long term and strategically in those first 2 weeks, when they're still trying to just have a bit of space that we talked about earlier, before recognizing that they need to start closing as much as they can in the last weeks of the quarter. So I think it's, as you say, there's balance, and maybe the habits are about encouraging some of that reflection. What went well in that last period, be it a month or a quarter? What went well? How did it go well? And what are the innovations we can try and take from that, or the good things that we can build on? So perhaps having conversations at the right time, and then recognizing, okay, guys, we're now moving into this period where we change, and now it's about, meeting the quota and bringing it in. So, I've not been a salesperson. I'm someone who works with people and brings out the best in people. So it's easy for me to say that from my observations. But that's what I see.
This is a subject I've been sort of thinking about more and more as well. How do you, and the notion of relationships is something that I think is something that is great to be measured over a long period. And so the reason why I say that, and I've not formally implemented this in my own practice yet, but if I have a target per se, I want to hit that target, and but actually over a longer time I want to develop that relationship, because I think it's through relationships that you are inevitably going to sell more. So is there a way of being able to target salespeople on their numbers, of course, and that is the sort of the status quo, but is there another objective, which is, can you measure and target a strength of a relationship within an account you're selling to, or within an account as a whole? Because that might drive longer term results, or have a bigger picture beyond, a quarterly result, for example. These are just thoughts that I've been playing around with.
Well, there's certainly a topic that I'm interested in, is just, I think this whole notion of relationship capitalization fits into that. And this is where some of the technologies can sit to enable you to be able to assess that. And of course, we have our mindset surveys, which are really interesting, to be able to gauge how customers perceive salespeople. And you have your net promoter scores that enable you to assess service levels and so on. So an aggregation of that data with contract values and trends can give you an idea of how relationships can progress. But of course, if a customer moves from one company to another, they often take the salespeople with them. So if you've got a good relationship score with someone at company X and they move to company Y, they'll take that score with them, if you like, because, you know, they like the way you've been dealing with them. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's a really important area to look at. And I'm encouraged by the science now that can help identify where those relationships are. So I think it's an opportunity for sure.
I guess it also goes back to what you were saying earlier, which is nowadays there is so much data that can be at the hands of, you know, a salesperson, and how that data and insights to that data can actually help enable salespeople in order to be
Yeah.
more effective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if we're looking at how to anticipate and prepare for change, what would you say business leaders need to do?
I think Louise is best placed for this one.
So how to prepare them for change? I think they certainly need some training and understanding about the process of change and what's, so they can understand the transition that they're going through as they experience change. So I think that's a really important thing to do, to help people appreciate that it's, I mean, some people love change. Some people adore change and just think of this as a real opportunity, and they embrace it and they can't wait and they want to make more change happen. And then other people are just, you know, they like the way they work, they like where they sit, or they like being at home, and they like the routine that they have every day. And so any change for them can kind of be seen as a threat, really. And how's it gonna impact them, and how's it gonna change their you know, their kind of habitual way of working, which they like and they know, and you know, so there has to be again that understanding of the individual, and then but the training can help them all understand each other's perspectives. Oh, so they're one of those that love it, there's someone I might need to help, and you know, and let them understand there are some opportunities here. There might be another part of the role that they really love that they haven't tried, you know, or some new skill they can pick up. So education around change is really, really important. I think, you know, through that, you can start to connect people to think about their own future in the midst of all this change. You know, what is it they want as they go forward through it, and to try and embrace it. And I think, Will, earlier you talked about, you know, people like to work within their comfort zones. So how do you help people stretch those comfort zones and really push the boundaries? And so that whole piece of education, I think, is really, really important. And then as they get more comfortable with that, they will start to look ahead, you know, getting them to think about, well, what does it mean for your career? What does it mean for your next step? What does it mean for your customer? How can you help your customers embrace it too? So as we've worked with some of our apprentices and students to think about this, they've gone on and worked with their customers to help them start to embrace change. So I do think taking the fear away, and helping people understand that the emotions they're experiencing are really quite normal. Most people go through those. To understand that everyone's way of embracing change might be at a different pace and in a different way. All of that is important. So that's what I would be encouraging sales leaders to understand themselves, and then to work with their teams to appreciate as well.
Yep.
Perhaps to add to what Louise was saying, I think sometimes it's quite good to consider the question: is what we are wanting to do, is it change or is it transformation? Are we just trying to take our operating system or the way of working that we've currently got and make it better? Yeah, is that where the change is going to come, or does it take a more profound shift of changing people's values and belief systems, winning their hearts and minds, you know, i.e. approaching change from a cultural perspective? And I think that quite often what you see when companies start to approach this topic of change is, you know, they're pretty good at mapping out, you know, what the new org structures need to look at like in the new processes, and maybe they have teams of consultants helping them do that. But one of the things perhaps they don't look at so closely is winning hearts and minds. And I think if one is going to help people focus on change, it's recognizing the difference between change and transformation, and providing them the tools to be able to do that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Phil, I think it's making people understand why the change is important, and perhaps linking that, as you talked earlier about purpose. This, if you can link it to the purpose of the organization, so this is going to enable us to help more people do this. Because of this change, we're going to be more efficient, or to try and link it to the purpose. Because as we said earlier, the kind of the millennials, they like the purpose is important. So if you can actually link it to the purpose, by this change will help us be more sustainable. It's going to reduce our carbon footprint. Whatever it is, if you can link it to something purposeful, that will also help.
Yes, and it comes back to, Louise, what you were saying around understanding people's values and what drives them, and being aware as a leader what they might be going through. I think that requires a lot of emotional intelligence.
I've got to go on another call in a few minutes.
All right. Do you just want to quickly summarize, both Louise and Phil, what would be your top tip then, if you were to choose one, what sales leaders need to consider going into 2023? Louise, why don't we start with you? Your top tip.
So I think understanding your team, I'm going to come up with two. Understanding your team to provide space for innovation.
I think mine would be to book time for yourself, to take time out.
And I'm just going to contribute mine as well. No one asked me. But yeah, I think it's so important when change is happening to you to find space to put your head above the parapet, whether that is scheduling time in your diary or going for a walk, is what you said, Louise. But time to give yourself the opportunity to reflect and to understand what the change means.
I've been terrible today because I've started at 7:30 this morning, and we're now at 4 o'clock this afternoon, and I haven't had one moment to stand above the parapet and to reflect. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the time I can do that. Maybe tomorrow.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Bo.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was great. Bye-bye.